The Trump administration is about to make life impossible for Gen Z. Well, for everyone, really. But it's going to land the hardest on the young pups of our great nation. They have no idea what's coming because conservative media has been lying to them. Liberal media hasn't told the whole truth either. And independent bro-culture manosphere media is deliberately poisoning them. Among voters under the age of 26 in 2024, women of color were the only ones to break for Harris. White men, white women, and men of color under 26 broke for Donald Trump. This is an astonishing trend with a whole lot of sociological, socioeconomic, and social media bias nuance behind it. And it reinforces just how damaged the Democratic Party brand is. If the left is going to make good on our quest to overthrow the party and use their apparatus to govern, it's our job to also recalibrate this relationship and make amends with younger people. So today, we're starting with student debt. This video explains how student debt grew to crisis levels, how the Trump administration's policies will push it over the top, and the only way to ultimately fix the system once and for all. UNFTR. Let's start with the size of the problem. After declining for the first time ever under the Biden administration, student indebtedness in the United States is on the rise again, and now more than $1.7 trillion. And listen, students, it's not your fault. I know. Hey, it's not your fault. Yeah, I know. Listen to me. It's not your fault. Don't do this. Not you. It's not your fault. Seriously. Go to college, they said. Get a degree. Build the next generation workforce. College is within your grasp. This messaging goes back before you were born. Of course, college is out of reach for the vast majority of Americans. Even public universities that used to be free are expensive these days. Yeah, I said public universities were once tuition free. What a novel concept, one that we'll come back to later. These days, we don't even seem to question why college is so expensive, especially considering many of the more notable ones have multi-billion-dollar endowments. So let's talk about who's affected. See, because applying for Pell Grants and scholarships is routine. Taking on student loans, easier than ever, and also fairly routine. So routine, in fact, that more than 42 million student borrowers have taken on federal loans. Now, importantly, only 7.8% of all student debt is private, which I'll lay out in great detail in a moment. So over 92% of student loans are federal, meaning issued by the U.S. government. And the most recent data show that the average student loan balance is $38,375, but when you include private loans, it actually reaches $41,000. As of the end of 2024, nearly 5% of federal loans were in default, with 10% of those borrowers defaulting within the first 3 years of repayment. As the economy worsens, that's only going higher. And the Trump administration is in the process of ripping out any provisions to help these borrowers get back on their feet. So keep these figures in mind as we talk about how these loan programs came to be and why college is so expensive. There's so much that we take for granted about this system because it's been a slow-moving catastrophe. And seriously, it's not your fault because it never should have gotten this far out of control. Okay, so how did we get here? Well, the movement to push everybody to a college degree started immediately after World War II. The introduction of the GI Bill for veterans included stipends to attend college and begin retraining the American workforce. And every administration from this point forward made a concerted effort to educate and train workers. Of course, the vast majority of black people and women were excluded, partially because Southern colleges didn't accept black students yet, and most women who served were deemed civilians and ineligible for loans. Just don't teach that in school because that's woke nonsense, otherwise known as history. But the government had a major challenge on its hands coming out of the war. Pushing for as many people to get a degree was one thing. For those people to afford it was another. So economists and policymakers started a debate that rages to this day as to how best to accomplish this. A mixture of grants, tax credits, and direct funding were cobbled together in fits and starts under Eisenhower, Truman, and Kennedy, but it wasn't until the Johnson administration that a framework came together that endures to this day. In an excellent 2021 book titled The Debt Trap: How Student Loans Became a National Catastrophe, author Josh Mitchell unpacks the messy history of student debt. In addressing the origins of federal student loan programs, Mitchell talks about how Johnson was trying to appease advocates for the poor, the colleges and universities themselves, and hardline conservatives loath to offer any sort of handouts. Quote, Johnson developed a compromise: scholarships for the poor and loans for the middle class. Within this solution, we can begin to identify the seeds of the modern student debt crisis. Because remember, at the time, there was no tolerance for deficits of any kind. We had to have balanced budgets. So when it came to who would be able to actually issue the loans, Johnson faced an uphill battle in Congress. And even though loans were theoretically a moneymaker over time, the proposition of adding so much to the federal budget would have created a short-term deficit that would blow too much political capital, or at least in Johnson's estimation. As Mitchell writes, quote, this is why Johnson didn't seek to simply expand the National Defense Student Loan Program, which drew money from the Treasury. Instead, Johnson turned to banks, end quote. So this way, Johnson could keep student loans essentially off the government's books. Now here's the key. Fearing that colleges would simply raise tuition to take as much money as possible in, which proved to be a prescient concern, he wanted schools to have skin in the game. So under his initial plan, schools and the feds would put part of the proceeds into an insured risk pool. That way, they both had an incentive to minimize defaults. Write that down. That'll be on the test later. After intense lobbying in D.C., an alternative solution was proposed and adopted, and the Higher Education Act was passed. It included scholarships for the poor and a loan program for the middle class. These loans for households earning less than $15,000 were guaranteed up to 80% if they defaulted, and the interest rate was 6%, which was considered competitive at the time. The problem was that banks were raising rates on other products faster than school loans, so they found little incentive to offer them despite the backstop of the federal government. In the meantime, college admission was growing due to the maturity of the baby boomer generation, so the colleges were flush with private paying students anyway. The whole thing just wasn't working. Again, Mitchell, quote, banks needed more money. Colleges needed more money. Students needed more money. The government's foray into student lending was already a mess, producing unintended consequences. Congress had passed the two loan programs hastily, with deference to banks and schools, and little thought to the perverse incentives that might lead to even higher tuition and taxpayer costs, end quote. Johnson turned to a young economist in the Department of Ed named Alice Rivlin, who sought to answer a crucial question: whether to give money to the students or the schools. It was decided that students were better equipped to manage the debts directly, but that there needed to be an agency to originate the loans. So as Johnson exited the stage and the Nixon regime began, a new corporation was established to provide a solution: Sallie Mae. Sallie Mae was established as a quasi-government organization that would sit off the books and pour liquidity into the banking system to be given out as loans. So the obvious question became, where would Sallie Mae get the money to lend? To answer this, the government gave Sallie Mae an unbelievable advantage. It allowed the corporation to borrow money cheaply, almost as cheaply as the government. As Mitchell writes, quote, Sallie Mae was part of a circuitous route between lender and borrower. The Treasury Department gave money to the Federal Financing Bank, which lent to Sallie Mae, which provided cash through warehouse advances and student loan purchases to banks, which lent to students who paid schools, end quote. If you're having a hard time following that, you're not alone. It was a Rube Goldberg financing scheme that only got worse over the years as corporate lobbyists and banks found ways to squeeze more and more out of the system and lay off risk. The government, under pressure of inflation and rising tuition, expanded grants and federal loans, which further jeopardized Sallie Mae's position in the market. Things were looking pretty shaky over at the agency, until a lobbyist named Mary Whalen came up with the solution to the problem that turned this into one of the most lucrative scams in history. Whalen and Sallie Mae pushed the government to get even more involved under the theory that if it was more in control of the process and flush, it could streamline the process and create a more efficient market. They just needed a little help and a little more independence. The idea was to institutionalize a form of arbitrage whereby Congress guaranteed Sallie Mae an additional 3.5% over its existing borrowing rate on every loan, and to allow Sallie Mae to tap into the market by offering shares of the company, essentially guaranteeing profits to Sallie Mae. So with guaranteed profits, Sallie Mae had no problem raising funds from both banks and colleges, and the company exploded. In 1983, Sallie Mae officially went public, and as Mitchell writes, quote, in April 1984, Sallie Mae joined the New York Stock Exchange. The company earned a AAA rating from Standard & Poor's, the equivalent of a perfect credit score. Investors bid up the stock price. End quote. The more money they took in, the more they lent out. The more money they lent, the more students took on debt. The more money the students were able to obtain, the higher the colleges pushed tuition, and on and on and on. Everything they did was guaranteed arbitrage. It was a thing of beauty for only two parties, Sallie Mae and the investors in the colleges that were all too happy to take the money lent to students. Sallie Mae was getting away with murder, and this did not escape the incoming Clinton administration that came from a generation that understood how fucked the system had become. Almost immediately, Clinton devised ways to bring the company to heel. As soon as he took office, he created direct loan programs through the federal government that soaked up 60% of all student loans within 4 years. This was crushing to Sallie Mae. But hope for Sallie Mae was right around the corner in the form of a Republican-controlled Congress, a CEO named Al Lord who was determined to crush Clinton's plan, and a battery of lobbyists and Wall Street investors determined to keep pushing the envelope. The multi-pronged strategy was brilliantly executed. Here's how they did it. They removed the quasi-governmental status tie and began removing government-appointed board members. Then they created pools of student loan investments that were securitized, just like how they bundled mortgages. They incentivized everyone in the company and board members alike with stock options to promote the offerings, and offered discounts in the market to incentivize students to use their programs instead of the government's direct program. They essentially bribed schools with equipment to get them to switch their recommended platform, and then they went hard after the adult learning market and for-profit colleges like University of Phoenix to take advantage of the growing interest in skills and certificate learning. So, taken together, these measures worked, and Sallie Mae started crushing it again. Quote, student debt took off. In 2000, Americans owed about $230 billion in federal student debt. By 2005, that figure had nearly doubled to roughly $415 billion. Around the same time, Sallie Mae lobbied for another shitty rule change to make it nearly impossible to charge off student loans in bankruptcy. Now, thankfully, this has eased up, but the damage for a short time was done to tons of borrowers. And this isn't the end of the story, mind you. During the financial crisis, when so many student debt holders suddenly began to default on their loans, the government actually had to bail out Sallie Mae. The financial crisis would create even bigger problems in the country as citizens struggled to get back on their feet, and in an attempt to promote higher education, as so many presidents had done before, Obama looked for ways to reduce the deficit while inducing more kids to obtain a degree. So he included a provision in the Affordable Care Act to eliminate the federal guarantee to private lenders to save money, but directed federal loans to be issued by the Treasury Department to expand the base of applicants. And the cycle continued. More kids, more debt. Higher tuition, higher cost of living. Fewer high-paying jobs, and compounding interest. Default, rinse, repeat. Now, to make matters worse, states were in such dire straits that they intensified the decades-long trend of cutting funding to state and community colleges, prompting them to increase the percentage of private tuition dollars required to attend. Underwriting standards were loosened to allow poor families, especially those of color, to obtain federal loans. Terms were extended. Interest continued to grow. All told, under Obama, student debt doubled to $1.3 trillion. And that's how we got here. Okay, so let's recap to help set the table for Trump. First, we sold the idea of college with great success to all Americans. Then we opened up the lending floodgates to both private and public institutions, relaxed standards enough to allow nearly everyone to qualify for some money, which colleges took as a signal to increase spending and raise tuitions, thereby necessitating larger and larger loans. Every recession, every economic downturn made these loans more difficult to manage. And during these recessions and downturns, states slashed budgets for community colleges, forcing public colleges to raise tuition to fill the gaps. Inflation has outpaced wage growth, making it more difficult to repay these loans. Union membership has declined to less than 10% in the United States, so pursuing a trade means you're in as precarious a position as everyone else. The private sector began demanding degrees for even entry-level positions. And colleges and universities have such high demand they can charge whatever they want because they know wealthy families can foot the bill and the government is going to give out loans to everyone. And the more money they raise and spend turning campuses into Disneyland, the more the public colleges feel the need to raise funds to compete. And the beat goes on. Greedy private colleges, public colleges trying to keep up with the Joneses while losing state support and funding, a private company competing with the government for student loans by lobbying for every advantage possible, hideous predatory investors sucking the savings out of the pockets of millions of American borrowers, defaults through the roof, rising inflation, rising interest rates, the inability to discharge student debt in bankruptcy, and a system so complex that one side thinks we should just cancel it all and the other thinks we should just let it ride. But canceling student debt doesn't solve the problem, it just reboots it. And letting it ride means an inevitable crash. There's a middle ground solution that no one is talking about, and I suspect it'll be a few years before anyone takes a pragmatic solution seriously. And I'll get to that. But first, as promised, let's talk about how Trump is going to deliver the death blow to students. Under the Biden administration, the overall indebtedness of students decreased for the first time. Billions of dollars in student loans were forgiven for those who worked in public service for a determined period of time. Now recall that he tried to forgive $10,000 per debt holder under the pandemic-era rules, but the court struck it down. So we got the watered-down version, which benefited a small portion of the population, to be sure, but the big effort was never to be heard from again. But he did institute another helpful program called the Fresh Start Program in 2022. So this allowed 7.5 million borrowers who had defaulted on loans to regain eligibility under income-driven repayment, or IDR plans, loan forgiveness options, and credit report repairs. This all happened under the Department of Education. Hint number one. That program ended in September 2024, though it would likely have resurfaced under a Harris administration in some form. One of the reasons for the program's success was direct outreach from the DOE. Because this is confusing stuff, so they committed a serious chunk of time and resources to helping people get back on their feet. So while you can now discharge student loans in bankruptcy, the process is still extremely arduous. And the point of education loans is not to drive one into bankruptcy as a result. So this program was a huge step. Now Trump is proposing to move loan origination and servicing to the Treasury Department, which might make sense from a streamlining perspective. That's where all the money comes from, after all. But in doing so, he's proposing to streamline the IDR process as well. But helping people manage their debt is a nuanced and difficult process. We should be expanding pathways to debt management and bankruptcy prevention, not narrowing them down. Hint number two. Because the Treasury isn't set up to manage the intricacies of student loans, there will be delays in servicing, which complicates things like credit report updates, programs that help returning students restart or access new loans, and facilitating enrollment into certain plans based on predetermined criteria. Of course, this is a stopgap measure to Trump's ultimate goal of privatizing all loans. And now you're really going to want to pay attention to this one. So privatization is the hardest path forward, but it's not as difficult as some might think, because it does take congressional approval. At a minimum, Trump wants to privatize loan servicing, which would absolutely reduce payment flexibility and increase punishment through aggressive collections. If anyone has ever been chased by a private debt collection agency, you know the misery that they can bring to one's life. And if we're to believe Project 2025, and at this point there's no reason to doubt it, once they have effectively neutered the Department of Education, Trump intends to eliminate things like Pell Grants. These are automatic scholarships given to low-income students, one of the most successful grants and programs in the country. So just on student debt, we're looking at the loss of scholarships for students from low-income families, limiting access to loan servicing programs, more aggressive collection practices, and fewer options to get on track and repair credit. So if defaults are currently around 5%, what happens when you consider the following? Federal employees are being fired by the tens of thousands, increasing the unemployment rate already. Cuts to social programs and nonprofit organizations on the federal level means fewer services for those in need. Cuts to state programs mean that states, which are required to balance their budgets, will have to increase taxes and lay off state employees and cut services. This will lead to more inflation and unemployment, which will force the Federal Reserve to maintain or increase interest rates to manage inflation under their stupid dual mandate. This will make student loans, which are already at high interest rates, even higher. Students coming out of college will find fewer jobs available as we go into a recession, exactly at the moment that they're being required to begin servicing their student loans. And without the ability to pause or refinance or get relief, they will increasingly default on loans and start their life's journey with shit credit. This shit credit will prevent them from getting an affordable car lease or an apartment. The only reasonable jobs available will still require a college education, as employers will have the pick of the litter due to high unemployment. So just opting out of college will be a non-starter. And for those who do opt out of college to pursue a trade, they'll come into a market where union protections are few and far between and private opportunities are at their lowest because the Trump administration thrust us into a deep and unnecessary recession. And when they look to the Trump administration for assistance, they'll find the only places that receive government spending and welfare outside of the military is the tech sector, because resident Nazi sympathizer and unelected chief operating officer of the country, Elon Musk, along with Peter Thiel, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg, have convinced the administration to pour money into more computing power and servers for artificial intelligence, which is itself designed to hollow out the middle service market of the labor pool. This is how Trump is thanking the generation that put him back into the Oval Office. Public universities and community colleges were always supposed to be free. We have to get there again. Because so many states are upside down, this would have to be a federal government initiative, and this isn't as difficult as it seems, and we can afford it. Ready? Back of the napkin math time. State contributions to higher education, which is a 4-year public institution or 2-year community college, will be around $129 billion this year. And that includes state financial aid contributions. The federal government allocates less than $1 billion in assistance. But the states only cover about 50% of the costs, so the other half is borne by students paying for tuition, housing, and dining, along with outside research grants and donations to endowments. So let's say it's about $260 billion all in. I say the federal government institutes a matching system. States kick in $130 billion, the feds match it. Now, obviously, the feds can cap the increase in matching funds. Like no one institution would receive more than 2% of what it received in the year prior. And they would still have the ability to fundraise and apply for grants. The only thing they couldn't do to qualify for federal matching funds is charge for tuition, housing, and dining. This kind of spending is non-inflationary. In fact, it would reduce inflation among private competitor schools. And here's how. By making public colleges far more competitive and free, this will put market pressure on private colleges to part with more of their egregious endowments and slow the pace of tuition growth. If all of a sudden the state public colleges and universities grow in prestige, they have all the bells and whistles of a private colleges, and it's free to attend, the private colleges will have to reduce costs to compete. Oh, and if they don't, who gives a shit? Let them price themselves out of the market. But the other way is to force private institutions to also have some skin in the game. I'm all for federal loan programs, but the character of these loans and the securitization of them has to fundamentally change. And on this, we have the answer. It was Lyndon Johnson's original idea of an insurance pool that colleges and the government pay into to cover defaults. The linchpin of this idea, however, is to forgive a substantial portion of existing loans and drastically cut the interest rate on all outstanding loans. This works in a couple of ways. First off, I'm for loan forgiveness at any level, 10 grand, 20 grand, whatever. Deal with the problem at hand to give the majority of debt holders some breathing room. Then the federal government should refinance the outstanding balance of every loan out there at the federal funds rate. Let people borrow at the same rate as the banks and extend the term of the loan out of the gate. This would dramatically reduce monthly payments. Moreover, to drive the nail in Sallie Mae's coffin, refinancing in this fashion should be available for all private loans as well. Fuck 'em. Sallie Mae needs to be put out of business. Leave BlackRock holding the bag. Oh yeah, did I mention that BlackRock is one of their largest shareholders? You know what else this does for the federal government? It all but eliminates defaults, which means it's more successful and self-funded over time. In fact, it becomes a profit center to help offset the matching funds to public colleges. And we know that low to no defaults is within reach because we almost got there under the Fresh Start program. And for God's sake, stop with the means testing. It's wrong, stupid, and mean. Wealthy people don't carry student debt. High net worth families and individuals don't have student debt. That's not how it works, nor has it ever. And stop worrying about the feelings of people who paid off their loans. For every one of them, there's another older person and sometimes senior citizen who's still paying theirs off and struggling. In fact, did you know that there's an entire segment of the senior population having their Social Security checks garnished to finish paying student debt? And as for the right wing who thinks it's a handout that steals money from the government, the SBA forgave more than $750 billion in PPP loans. This money was treated as below-the-line income and therefore non-taxable. In other words, free money. What about them? Also, it's estimated that wealthy Americans are holding somewhere around $10 trillion offshore to avoid taxes, or the hundreds of billions of dollars in tax cuts under Bush, Obama, and then more under Trump that favored the wealthy. Where's the entitlement argument there? Put Sallie Mae out of business and make colleges put skin in the game. Make public college free again. Offer some relief today and fix the system for tomorrow by refinancing at the same rate the banks pay. This is the battle we need to wage when we retake control of the government. These are the kind of things that we need to do to regain the trust of our youth. These are the investments into their education and futures that we need to make. We can yell at them until we're blue in the face about how Donald Trump is going to fuck them over and hand their future over to his billionaire tech buddies. But why would they believe us when we've done nothing to prove that we have their best interest at heart? So now they're going to go learn the hard way that Trump used them and is fucking them over. It's our job to have a plan instead of taking them for granted again as the least worst option available to them. Here endeth the lesson. If you're into this topic and want to learn more about it, definitely pick up a copy of Josh Mitchell's The Debt Trap. I've linked it below. And let me know what you think about the solutions that I offered toward the end in the comments below. And if you like the video and what we offer on this channel, I'd be really grateful for the like and subscribe because it helps us reach more people. And don't forget, you can sign up for our free weekly newsletter at UNFTR.com. It comes out every Saturday and features important progressive articles, an economic chart of the week, original content, book and podcast recommendations, and a bit of silliness to help the medicine go down. As always, thank you to our members for supporting our work. You can find out more about our membership benefits, where we provide exclusive access to our member Discord channel, send out incredibly cool stickers like these. This is one of my favorites. This has got Mikhail Bakunin in it. Here's one that's all about the earth. Be kind to your mother. This is one of our OG ones. It's got fuck Milton Friedman, FMF all over it. This is a fun one that 99 did. Well, she did them all, but she put her love and soul into it. Look at the Bernie and the Barbie font, right? She's got a Grateful Dead thing on there. UNFTR is Wordle. Marxism, there's a Spotify thing here at the top, right? Where is it? Right there. The Spotify thing there, where if you put it on your phone or something like that, people can just automatically download the podcast onto their phone. There's some anti-DeSantis stuff and some Proud Pride stickers that we've got. And these are our 5 non-negotiables showing up in a sticker pack, all for you. Climate justice, housing first, Medicare for all. I can't see a goddamn thing, but End Citizens United. And anyway, we send out cool shit like that and stickers, and we offer discounts and on our merchandise and our coffee. And for pro and over-caffeinated members, we list you in the credits like these fine folks.
This is the story of a political pundit who looked at the world around him and just said, fuck it. Gives the middle finger to authority and says, kiss my ass. But instead of a revolution, he started a podcast. Just what the world needs. Started a podcast. Another basic white guy who started a podcast. But it's fun because he curses all through the